Okay, we are live. Hello and welcome, everybody. Today's date is May 24th, 2025, and this is the inaugural debate here on the Atheist Debates channel. So, over the years, Matt has posted debates done elsewhere, both online and in person, but this is the first time we've hosted one here live. And for this initial run, we have selected somebody who has called into many of the live programs we do over on the line and demonstrated that he's very serious and dedicated to defending his beliefs and goes beyond the typical attempts we get from most of our callers. So felt right to kick off the series with someone like this who, irrespective of age or credentials, we want, someone who's going to honestly present what they believe and defend their position. So if you are watching and you're someone like this and you would like to participate, definitely feel free to contact Matt or I to try to get that set up. So, all right, today's topic and format. The topic for today is we should believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being. Arguing in the affirmative for that is Matthew Adelstein here on the right side of the screen. And arguing on the negative is Matt Dillahunty. We'll be doing 15-minute openings, beginning with the affirmative. 5-minute rebuttals for each, beginning with the affirmative, 30 minutes of open discussion, and then 30 minutes of questions from the audience. We'll be sourcing those through super chats. I'm not going to put a super chat threshold on the donation to get your super chat read for the question. It's much easier to sort that way. So if you only have $1, that is a-okay. And I'm not going to promise we're going to get to every question. They're going to be sourced and curated based on what's relevant to the things the hosts have said. Then there'll be 5-minute closing statements at the end, beginning with a negative. That way, Matthew, our guest here, gets the first and last word. So again, I'll be moderating the chat for super chats and questions, but we're not trying to make a lot of money off this. It's just more efficient that way. So with that, Matthew, if you are ready, let me set you up here and get the timer ready. All right, are you ready?
Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, go ahead.
All right. So first, let me thank Arden for moderating and Matt for agreeing to do this. Matt and I agree about the importance of considering evidence and avoiding irrational dogmatism in pseudoscience, like denial of vaccine efficacy and belief in young Earth creationism. If you at home would like to follow along with my opening statement, on my blog, Bentham's Bulldog, which you can find by Googling, you can find a written transcript of it with sources included, as well as links to where you can find out more about the arguments I'm giving. One brief comment before I get into the arguments. I think a lot of atheists can have a tendency not to give theistic arguments a fair shake, to assume from the outset that they must be stupid, like belief in Santa Claus. This isn't rational. Many smart philosophers and scientists believe in God, unlike Santa Claus. While this doesn't make the view true, it does mean that it's pretty unlikely that all the arguments for it are obviously fallacious. Many atheists, like Alex O'Connor, have come to see theistic arguments as more formidable than they previously believed after studying philosophy. I think many of my disagreements with Matt will come down to epistemology, which is about how one comes to know things. So let me describe how I think one should evaluate hypotheses about the world. First, one should look at the prior probability of a hypothesis, how likely it is before gathering any data. Even though the theory that I'm cheating in poker and the theories that fairies rigged a deck so that I'd get 10 royal flushes both explain the data of me getting 10 royal flushes, it's likelier that I'm cheating because it has a higher prior probability. Next, one should look at the evidence. Evidence for a hypothesis is simply anything that's likelier if the hypothesis is true than if it's false. Now, this isn't just my conjecture. Mathematicians have shown that if some event is likelier given a hypothesis is truth than its falsity, then that event makes the hypothesis more likely. This became formalized through something called Bayes' theorem. For example, suppose that you want to figure out if I'm cheating in poker, and suppose you think the odds that I'd cheat are low, maybe 1 in 10,000. Thus, in order for the evidence to establish that I'm cheating with more than 50% probability, it must be that my stream of luck is so unlikely that it's more than 10,000 times likelier it would happen by cheating than by chance. This is the method applied in science and history. Consider the discovery of dark matter. Scientists believe dark matter exists because light from faraway galaxies seems to be bent as if affected by gravity, but the places giving off the gravitational field don't release any light. In addition, the speed of galactic rotation seemed to indicate more mass than we could observe. Scientists came to believe, thus, that there was dark matter, a kind of invisible matter that exerted gravity, because it explained these otherwise puzzling facts about the world. It wasn't first demonstrated that dark matter is possible, nor was there any kind of direct experimental verification. Scientists instead believed it because the supposition that there was invisible matter wasn't wildly unlikely in terms of its prior probability, and it explained the evidence very well. Similar things apply to the discovery that Hannibal used elephants to cross the Alps. This wasn't first demonstrated to be possible, but was believed because it was the best explanation of written records of Hannibal crossing the Alps and soil samples containing large feces deposits. Now, people criticize this method by saying that we have no way of precisely deciding upon the priors and the degree of the update. But to apply this method, you don't need highly precise priors, only rough approximations. I don't know the exact prior probability of evolution, but there's clearly enough evidence to believe it. So now let's apply this methodology to God. First, consider the prior probability of God. The prior probability, how likely a view is before considering the evidence, is influenced by various factors. Two major ones are simplicity and non-arbitrariness. The theory that the world is infinite in size has a higher prior than the theory that it's exactly 10 quadrillion light years across, because infinity is a less arbitrary size. Similarly, as Occam's razor tells us, we should not multiply entities without necessity. That's why, absent a good reason, you shouldn't think that there's an uncaused teapot between here and Mars. Note that as the atheist philosopher Jonathan Schaffer argues, Occam's razor should be about the number of unexplained or fundamental entities rather than the total number of entities that exist. Otherwise, solipsism would be the simplest theory because it just posits your mind rather than a big universe. By this metric, theism, which I use to mean that there is a perfect God, does very well. It posits only one fundamental entity, a mind totally without limit. Because this mind is unlimited, nothing restricts its power or awareness, so it can do anything and it knows everything. Once it's omnipotent and omniscient, it will act to do the right thing, because a perfectly rational person would come to see the irrationality of immorality. Just as if you're rational, you won't be racist, as racism is irrational, and you won't arbitrarily privilege your present self over your future self. A perfectly rational, limitless mind wouldn't arbitrarily privilege anyone over anyone else, and thus would be morally perfect. This also shows the error of the claim that belief in God is like belief in fairies or unicorns. Fairies and unicorns are very complicated things. They have many distinct properties with no core explanation, and there's no evidence for them. In contrast, God is the simplest possible kind of mind, simply one without limit. The world has three kinds of things: abstract objects like numbers, the material world, and minds. Now, minds can't reduce to the physical world because no amount of matter alone is enough by itself to produce a mind. As the philosopher Frank Jackson famously argued, while reading textbooks could allow you to learn every physical fact about the world, for instance, you could learn the laws of physics from a book, it wouldn't allow you to learn everything about minds, like what it's like to see red if you've never seen red. Thus, minds must not be purely physical, because textbooks can teach you every physical fact, but not every mental fact. But if minds are non-physical fundamental entities, a limitless mind is a very simple kind of thing. One category of fundamental reality instantiated without limit. It also is distinctly non-arbitrary because it's completely without limit. Now, you don't have to think all of this is obviously true. It only needs to be plausible enough for theism to start with a somewhat reasonable prior probability. Dark matter didn't start with a very high prior, but it's reasonable to believe in because it had lots of evidence, and its prior wasn't too low. So now let's turn to the evidence. In my view, there's a lot of evidence, more than I can list here, but let me just discuss a few lines. First is the fine-tuning of the constants in physics, meaning the values that go into the equations of physics. Around 1980, physicists discovered that many of the constants are finely tuned, in the sense that they fall in an infinitesimal range that happens to be the only kind that can form complex structures. If the cosmological constant were a bit weaker, the universe would have collapsed in on itself right after the Big Bang. And if it were a bit stronger, every atom would have been ripped apart so that no two particles ever interacted. Luke Barnes, an influential physicist, calculated that the odds of getting finely tuned constants by chance are only 1 part in 10 to the power of 136. That's about as unlikely as throwing a dart across the known universe and hitting a particular atom. Well, actually, that's about 40 orders of magnitude less likely, but who's counting? If there's a god of the sort I described, this fine-tuning is probable, or at the very least, not astronomically improbable. God, being good, wants valuable stuff to exist, so he'd set the constants to whatever value is needed for life. In contrast, on atheism, the odds are astronomically tiny. Thus, this is one line of evidence for theism. It's a fact that's likelier if there's a god than if there's no god. Atheists have lots of ways to try to explain this, and I can't hope to discuss them in detail, but if you want a lengthier rebuttal to the objections, check out my article, The Fine-Tuning Argument Simply Works. A second bit of evidence is consciousness itself. If there's a perfect God, he'd want to create conscious agents, because conscious agents are good things. However, if there's no God, then it's a surprise that consciousness exists at all. why would particles moving around give rise to subjectivity? This is especially so if you agree with the arguments I gave before, showing that the material world alone isn't enough to produce consciousness by itself. Thus, to get consciousness on atheism, you need extra special consciousness laws, which are improbable. A third line of evidence is the fact that the laws give rise to any life and anything of value. It would be much simpler for there to simply be a single particle that never does anything, or for there to be two particles circling around each other for eternity. Those studying cellular automata, dots moving around, have discovered that with a random set of laws, you're much likelier to get either total chaos or simple patterns that don't produce any structure than to get the kind of stable order needed for life. This even leads the mathematician Yuan Squires in a published paper to propose that we may live in the simplest possible interesting world, interesting in the technical sense of producing complex structure. If there's a God, it makes sense that our world would have the balance of simplicity and complexity to give rise to an interesting world. In contrast, in a godless world, either a world that never produces any conscious life at all and just has particles moving around in highly repetitive patterns, or one that's random chaos, is far, far more likely than this world. The fourth bit of evidence is the fact that you exist. Now, this one's a little bit complicated, so strap in. Your existence can give you evidence for many things. For example, your existence gives you evidence that your parents didn't use effective contraception. But can it give you evidence for God's existence? Well, as I've argued in a published paper, your existence is likelier. Oh, I just lost my place. Your existence is likelier if more people exist, just as it's likelier that your card would be drawn from a deck if all the cards are drawn than if just one card is drawn. Now, here's where things get weird. Because the number of possible people is a very large infinite, as the philosopher David Lewis showed, for your existence to be likely, it must be that a very large infinity worth of people get created, which is likelier given God than atheism. So your existence gives you infinitely strong evidence that the number of people that got created is the most people that could have been created, which is likelier if there's God than if there's no God. To illustrate this, let's consider an analogy. Suppose that a coin is tossed. If it comes up heads, one person is created. If it comes up tails, 10 people get created. After getting created, you should think it's 10 times likelier it came up tails, because that makes it 10 times likelier that you'd get created. But now suppose that if it came up tails, instead infinity people would get created. Well, now by the same logic, you should think that tails is infinitely likelier than heads. If 10 people existing makes your existence 10 times likelier, then infinity people existing makes your existence infinity times likelier. I have one final case, but first I'll need to explain something about infinity. As mathematicians have firmly established, there are bigger and smaller infinities. The smallest infinity is called Aleph null, and it's the maximum number of people that you could fit into one single universe. But the number of possible people is a much bigger infinity. An infinite multiverse could have a number of people that could never fit in a single universe, even one infinite in size. Now, let's consider the last case. A coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, Aleph null, the smallest infinity, people get created. If it comes up tails, a much bigger infinity worth of people get created. Upon being created, you should think the coin came up tails. It's infinitely likelier that you'd get created if the coin came up tails than heads, because infinity more people get created by tails than heads. You might doubt that your existence is likelier if more people exist, as the argument suggests. But this must be wrong. To see this, imagine one person is created, and then a coin is flipped. And if it comes up tails, 9 other people get created. Suppose you learn that you get created, but you don't know your birth rank. Then you're told that you're the first person. Because the odds that you'd be the first person are only 1 in 10 if there are 10 people, well, they're 100% if there's only one person. Unless you start out thinking that 10 people existing makes your existence 10 times likelier, you get the result that the odds of a coin coming up heads before it's been flipped are 10/11ths rather than 50%. But this is ridiculous. Fair coins come up heads half the time. If there's a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet, you should think there's a 50% chance that it will come up heads. Worse, we can get even more absurd results by changing around the numbers, so that you end up arbitrarily certain of improbable chancy events, like that you'll get many royal flushes in poker, so long as if you don't get many royal flushes in poker, lots of people get created. In short, then, it's been conclusively demonstrated that so long as before flipping a coin, you should think there's a 1/2 chance that it will come up heads, it must be that your existence is X times likelier if there are X times as many candidates for being your present self. Now note, there are many more arguments for the idea that your existence gives you evidence that there are more people. I've compiled a list of 27 of these arguments, in fact. I'm happy to discuss many of the others if Matt is doubtful of this principle. But if you think your existence is likelier if more people exist, and infinitely likelier if infinity people exist, then from the fact that you exist, you should think with certainty that there are infinite people. But this doesn't just stop at infinity. As we saw in the above example, you're likelier to exist if a bigger infinity of people exist than a smaller infinity. Thus, you should think that the number of people that exist is the very most that there could be. Whatever the maximum infinity worth of people that there could be is, that's how many people exist. Otherwise, only 0% of possible people exist, and your existence is infinitely unlikely. So far, we've shown that there's a giant infinity worth of people. Once again, this fits well with theism. A limitless perfect God would want to create a giant infinity worth of people to give a good life to as many people as possible. Thus, he'd be expected to make a huge multiverse containing an enormous infinity worth of people. In contrast, if there is no God, even if there's a multiverse, it's highly unlikely to be big enough to contain the most people that there could be, which is, remember, an infinity of people too large to fit in a single universe and more than the number of numbers. None of the existing multiverse models have enough people to make your existence anything but infinitely unlikely. Such views also have the problem that they undermine induction, but unfortunately I don't have time to discuss that issue in detail. Now, this was all a bit technical, so let me give the two-sentence synopsis. Warning, these are long sentences. If anything other than the most people that there could be exists, because each infinity is infinitely bigger than smaller infinities, then only 0% of possible people exist, and your existence is infinitely unlikely. Therefore, from the fact that you exist, you should conclude that the number of people that exists is the most that it could be, but given that there could be a giant infinity worth of people, too many to fit in one universe or in any but the most gerrymandered of atheist multiverses, that gives you strong evidence for the existence of a good God who wants to create with no limits on how much he can create. Laid out more succinctly, the three steps are: 1, your existence is X times likelier if there are X times as many people. 2, if that's right, then you should think the maximum number of people there could be exists. And 3, the maximum number of people existing is likelier given theism than atheism. Now, this is a complicated argument, so I encourage you to read about it more. I have an article called The Ultimate Guide to the Anthropic Argument that explains it in more detail. It's convinced some very competent philosophers, and at least one atheist mathematician takes it very seriously. So if you're thinking it's dumb for a very simple reason, probably you're misunderstanding it. Here I've presented 4 bits of evidence that point to God's existence: the fine-tuning of the constants, the existence of consciousness, the fact that the universe has laws capable of giving rise to complex structures without devolving to random chaos, and the fact that you exist out of the infinite number of possible beings, which is only likely if a God of limitless creative power exists. I've additionally argued that theism has a high likelihood even before looking at the evidence, because it explains so much, so well, it's likely to be true. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the debate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. All right, we are going to switch over to hear Matt's opening. Matt, are you ready?
I believe I'm, whoops. Is my audio on?
Yep.
Then I'm ready.
All right, go ahead.
All right, huge thank you to everybody for tuning in, and to Matthew for doing this, and to Arden for producing and hosting it as well. The issue before us is we should believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect God. And when we say we should believe something, the question then becomes the how or the why. This is potentially where, epistemologically speaking, we may differ the most. To quote Hume, the wise man proportions his confidence to the evidence. And so there are things that aren't particularly well supported by evidence, and your confidence that in their likelihood and the probability that they're true should be lower than things that are incredibly well supported. We have evidence that, or when we have claims that are and ideas that are well supported, we should have a higher confidence in them. I don't think that we can be absolutely certain about anything, but there are things where we may reach what I've called kind of maximal certainty. However certain we can be based on not being able to demonstrate the primacy and infallibility of logic, then that would be the maximum. If it's absolute, I don't know. So what counts as evidential support? Not just facts consistent with a proposition, but facts that strongly suggest one proposition is more likely than another. Matthew also gave a definition about likelihood and what evidence is for a proposition versus just facts consistent with. I'm happy to go with that. But things that are calculable, hard data, empirical observations, all submitted with independent testing and verification, all should lead to stronger conclusions and stronger confidence in conclusions than things with less calculable, less empirical support. Saying something like, I love you, isn't really calculable. It isn't detectable easily in a measurable way, and yet it still represents a common experience and a category of claims that we tend to consider real. We have to frame it in the right category. It's an emotional experience. Love is a description of what my brain prefers and values and how it responds to certain stimuli. And despite our inability to thoroughly detect it and quantify it and everything else, we at least generally recognize that this is real, that this is something about the human experience or a brain's function. Now, I can have a rational belief that someone loves me, even though I can't calculate it, knowing full well I may be wrong. My confidence that they love me is going to be different depending on the actions and the data that supports it, but I can't quantify it. So belief isn't just about data supporting a syllogism, though that would be the strongest. But it's also about warranted belief, which should be frameable in that context. There should be a way to frame a list of propositions such that the conclusion is my brain is rationally warranted in accepting that someone else cares about me. The information is consistent with that. And so when we talk about what we should believe those things that are strongly supported by evidence, and we should reserve judgment until such time as that takes place. So in this particular debate, we're talking about an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being. So let's look at those properties real quick. All-powerful. How can I tell the difference between more powerful and even more powerful and all-powerful? We are simply limited in what we are capable of confirming. So, to quote Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in this case, the question then becomes, what does sufficiently mean? Sufficiently advanced? How do we even address that? And generally, it just means anything that's beyond our understanding, beyond our ken, qualifies as advanced beyond our ability to assess it properly. And if you get far enough beyond that, it might be indistinguishable from magic or indistinguishable from a god. Modern theologians tend to avoid the cookie cutter simple, God is all powerful, and instead describe all power that is logically possible or logically consistent. The notion that God couldn't violate the principles of logic is kind of prevalent in modern theological discussions. So I'm not trying to do the can God create a burrito so hot that he can't eat it response. But the issue here is if we're going to say that God is all powerful, I don't know how we can identify that. The same problem exists with all knowing. Does that mean all possible knowledge? And what knowledge is or isn't possible? Do we even have the capability of determining all of what knowledge is or isn't possible? Is God knowledgeable about the future? And to what extent? And what are the impacts of that potential knowledge? I was accused of being a know-it-all, even though I don't. And that's hyperbole and a pejorative. And it's a way to kind of get someone who knows a topic better than you to take them down a peg without actually having to know the topic better. But how could we tell whether or not somebody genuinely knew it all? Any sufficiently advanced knowledge and understanding beyond our ability is indistinguishable to us from all knowledge. Could we even think of the question that we would need to ask to stump the thing that is supposedly all-knowing to show that it's not? And then we get to the third prong, which is the moral perfection, and that is the same problem. I did a video recently on is God perfect, and using the impossibility of perfect circles to suggest that perhaps God as a perfection isn't even possible, but I definitely don't know how we could possibly assess it. And so when I hear someone arguing for an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being, I have to wonder how much of that is hyperbole, or what skills and knowledge and understanding do they actually possess that allows them to evaluate this entity that I have no reason to even believe exists and determine that it has these features. So for the sake of this debate, let's soften the debate topic a bit. And let's say, instead of should we believe in an omni, should we believe in a pretty powerful, mostly knowing, pretty good God? And so the question then becomes not so much, how can I tell whether or not he's all-knowing, but is it sufficiently powerful to create a universe? Is it sufficiently knowledgeable to do so? What are its desires? What are the things it wants? And once again, I don't know. If I pull out a calculator, it has some level of precision and some minimal display where it can put out the answer. And so is there no end to pi, or is there an end that we haven't found? There's no end to pi. That's our understanding from mathematics. But is anything truly random, or are there just patterns that we can't detect? And if my calculator is only correct to 8 10 digits, 12 digits. How can I possibly be more accurate beyond that without using some additional tool or method? What types of things definitely wouldn't prove an Omnimax God? Almost anything you can think of. Statistics, assertions, holy books, none of them give us the requisite understanding or knowledge to confirm that there is a being out there like this. But if we soften it down to, hey, there's a pretty powerful being, and then we try to argue for, hey, here's a universe that we need an explanation of its origins, and this universe or your existence or whatever are going to be more probable if there's a being that's capable of doing that. Yes. And it's interesting, I'll get to in the rebuttal portion, that Matthew and I both are going to reference poker and other things in this, because we're talking about statistics and Bayesian analysis for a good chunk of it. But what if it comes down to can just merely a claim that gods must be sufficiently powerful, and that on that likelihood, therefore that results in us? If that God came down, the God that Matthew's arguing for, if it came down and stood here, right here with us today, and said, I am that God, how could we possibly tell? What if we only think it's that God because it's more amazing than what we've seen and more powerful than we could have comprehended? And then right when we decide, yep, that's God, another being shows up and snaps its fingers, and the first God goes away. And then another, and then another, in an endless series of things that are more powerful than us and more powerful than we can comprehend, wiping out the other things that were more powerful. At what point can we say we've reached perfection? Maybe, much like infinity, you can't reach it. Infinity isn't quantifiable. It's not something you could count to. It is a concept, and there are bigger and smaller infinities. And yet we live in a world where nothing at all like a God presenting itself to justify itself ever seems to happen. Predictable statistical models don't include God or magic or the supernatural, and yet they're all vastly more reliable than any God claim. God will help you, they say, if you seek him out and he's in the mood. God will intervene in reality on his terms, which may or may not ever happen. God answers prayer. Sometimes he answers with yes, sometimes he answers with no, sometimes he answers with wait, and yet you're never made aware of what the answer is, so you must merely assume that you know what the answer is. Well, let's not assume that the fact that something is unlikely means that we can just invent a magical being, a panacea, to make it seem more likely and declare then that it is in fact real. What morally perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful being would allow us to sit around and argue and fight and kill each other over whether he exists and not step in to settle the issue? What morally perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful being would place people in a world where rational evaluation of evidence leads to the most accurate models of reality, only to seemingly exempt its own existence from that standard, rewarding faith, rewarding intuitive leaps that lack justification? I'd argue that such a God is less powerful, less knowledgeable, and less moral than almost any of us. If your kids are fighting over whether or not you love one of them more than the other, and you don't step in to settle it, you're a monster. Should we believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect God? No. Or more accurately, not until there's sufficient evidence and rational warrant for it. And I have no idea how to get there. This is a subject I've spent much of my life doing, and I used to be a believer, and I used to be a believer for a number of the same reasons that Matthew has presented and that other people have presented. And then I find flaws, both sometimes logical fallacies, not always formal structural fallacies, but instead misunderstandings about causality, or claiming that because something is statistically probable or likely, therefore it's true. And that is always a mistake. And the best example I can give right at the top of my head is, we'll stay away from poker for now. If I roll two dice, two standard six-sided dice, there's a 1 in 36 chance that they're going to come up with double sixes. If I pick up those dice and I intentionally set them down with 2 6s up, there's a 100% chance that that's going to happen, which means if you come up to any table and there's a pair of dice there with double 6s up, it is more likely that that is a result of someone intentionally setting them that way than it is that they were rolled that way. And yet you have no way, based on that single observation, even knowing the statistics of dice rolls, to determine that that was the result of someone intentionally setting them down that way. And yet that seems to be kind of what we're doing. I have no idea how to get to the Omnimax God or a God that's hiding from us or anything else. But when you define God as potentially existing outside of space and time, you have defined it away. When you infer a God to explain gaps in our knowledge or to make that which is unlikely seem likely, you've created a just so story. And so my view is that instead of going with a just so story, I'd rather go with an I don't know that leaves it open to, can you present better evidence for this? Can you show that you haven't just invented a panacea that can be used to explain anything? As a matter of fact, I'd be curious to know, and we'll ask and discuss later, is there anything about reality that is less probable on the proposition that a God who wants it to happen exists? That, to me, is one of the best ways of considering a different version of a watchmaker analogy, where you find a watch on a beach and declare that it must be designed, inferring its design from all the other information you have that is not included in the thought experiment, when in the theistic reality, where everything is designed and created, you have found a watch on a beach of watches in a universe of watches surrounded by watches, and you picked up a watch and said, this one is special. You're highlighting a single instance and declaring this is more probable on this other explanation. Therefore, that other explanation is the one we should go with. That is simply false.
All right. So we are going to move on to our rebuttals. We are charging up the clock for 5 minutes. Matthew is first. If you are ready, I will hit the button.
Yeah. All right, so thanks for that, Matt. So first of all, let's note that Matt has not given evidence against God's existence. And so I think the question comes down to just whether the evidence for God is enough to bring belief in God over the threshold for it being reasonable to believe. Now, one of the things Matt says is that we need to have hard data and empirical evidence to believe in God. First of all, I think I've given hard data and empirical evidence. The fact that you exist, that's a fact about the world. That's empirical, you know? The fact that our laws are life-permitting, the fact that consciousness exists, the fact that there are finely tuned constants, each of these things are empirical. Second, I don't think we need empirical evidence for all of our beliefs that we're justified in holding. We're justified in thinking we're not brains and vats, even though we don't have empirical evidence against it, as that makes the same empirical predictions as other theories. Third, the standard is self-defeating because we don't have any empirical evidence that we need empirical evidence for any theory. And fourth, this would result in us throwing out much of our knowledge from history, because that comes not from empirical evidence, but from documentary records. Matt asks why we should think there's an all-powerful being and not just a very powerful being. I'd say, first of all, we should think that for reasons of parsimony. The same reason that it's likelier that the universe is infinite in size than that it's exactly 32,531,000,000 ... meters across, is because it's a simpler theory. It's less arbitrary. It's more parsimonious. Second, if we just assume that there's a limited God of some sort, that doesn't predict any of the data I've given. There's no reason to think that a limited God of some sort would want to bring about life. In contrast, if there's a perfect God, because it's good to create life, there's a positive reason to expect it to create life, a positive reason to expect it to do a lot of creating, to create consciousness, and so on for each of the data points that I've given. Third, one thing that philosophers like Josh Rasmussen have described is that if something has arbitrary limits, that's a defect to the theory. So if a thing is just limited in a certain way, but there's no explanation of why it's limited in that way, that's a defect of the theory. That's why it would be a bad theory to think that, for example, the laws of physics work the same way, except in one little patch, because there's no explanation for why it stops working that way in that patch. And so if God has a great deal of power, but he's just limited in certain ways, that would seem to be deeply arbitrary and improbable. It would be deeply strange if the ultimate first being was this mind, who had a great range of powers, but who didn't have every power. And it would be much simpler than the hypothesis that I've given, which is simply that there's a limitless mind. Next, Matt asks what all-knowing means. Now, all-knowing just means that for every fact is true, a person knows it. It's a pretty straightforward concept. It means you know everything. Matt asks if God knows the future. I think that God does know the future, but I think that's a bit outside the scope of the debate. As an analogy, I don't actually know if God knows the truth of Goldbach's conjecture, because I don't know if Goldbach's conjecture, if it's true, but that's not a problem for belief in God, because the point is just whether it's true or not, God knows it. Similarly with the future, the idea is if the future is already fixed, then God knows it. Now, Matt suggests that we need to first prove that a thing is possible in order to be justified in believing it. But I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's the methodology applied in science. The way that scientists concluded that dark matter existed wasn't that they first proved that it was possible, but that they got evidence that it was real. And so because it was not a very outlandish hypothesis and it explained the evidence so well, they ended up believing it. Now, Matt says that we couldn't definitively prove that if a being came down from the sky, we couldn't definitively prove that it was all-powerful rather than just very powerful. But it doesn't matter that we couldn't know that with certainty. We could have good evidence that for that theory, even if it's not, even if we're not certain that the being is all-powerful rather than very powerful. And for the reasons I described, a merely very powerful being would seem to be arbitrary, would seem to be limited in arbitrary respects, and would seem to less well predict the data. I also think this probably means that by Matt's standard, there couldn't be any evidence for the existence of God. After all, by Matt's logic, if God came down to Earth and ushered in the second coming, he doesn't think that would be a good reason to believe in an all-powerful God. Now, I think that sets the bar way too high. Matt says that infinity is a concept. No, I don't think infinity is a concept. Concepts are things in our heads. Infinity are things in the world. There are infinite numbers. And I think the universe might be infinite in size, and it might have been infinite in size even before anyone had concepts of infinity, which shows that infinity is not merely a concept, but it's a thing in the world. Matt asks why would a powerful being be hidden, but he hasn't given a reason to think that a being couldn't have a reason to be hidden. There's no reason to expect that God would immediately reveal himself rather than making it so that you have to use your brain to figure out that he exists. And given that the afterlife can be infinite, there's no reason to think that for the entire infinite years of our total existence that he would be revealed. God being hidden also allows people to help other people come to knowledge of the truth, which is very valuable and unites them. Matt says that it's a mistake to believe things just because they're statistically likely, but by definition, if something is statistically likely, it's probably true. And the mistake Matt made in his example was you also have to consider the prior probabilities for it to be reasonable. Lastly, Matt proposes that we should go with the explanation of I don't know, but we shouldn't go with that explanation any more than we go with it in the dark matter case. When we have enough print that point in favor of one hypothesis, we should just go with the explanation that explains all the facts all in one fell swoop, rather than just saying we don't know.
All right, that's time. All right, time is charged up for Matt. 5-minute rebuttal. Matt, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, go for it.
I've got a deck of cards over here. There's 52 cards in there. If you shuffle it, the number of permutations is 52 factorial, and that's 8 times 10 to the 67th power. That's more permutations for a deck of cards than there are grains of sand on Earth. As a matter of fact, if you were to take a grain of sand, hide it somewhere on Earth, and tell a friend to go find it, the odds that they would pick that grain of sand randomly are 5 times 10 to the 23rd, which is essentially still 0 compared to the number of permutations in a deck of cards. And you could do the same thing with protons within atoms on Earth, and that's 3.57 times 10 to the 51st. So if we shuffle a deck, that order is statistically unlikely to have ever occurred in the history of the world. And yet, despite that, decks come in a new deck order, which narrows the scope a little bit. So the first shuffle, depending on the type of shuffle you do, is only going to possibly reach a limited portion of all the possible permutations. But after a certain number of shuffles, every possible permutation becomes likely or similarly probable. Pick up any deck of cards, and we assume it's been fairly shuffled. Whatever order those cards are in is by definition more likely if someone intentionally set up that deck in that order. But the existence of that order could never be sufficient to conclude that it was in fact intentional. So it's correct for us to determine this particular order of cards in the deck is more likely if someone intentionally structured it that way. But that fact alone is not enough to conclude reasonably that, in fact, that is what happened or that is what likely happened in that instance. See, statistics address broader range, a number of different trials. You can do it with a paradise. You can have a Galton board out where each individual ball goes down and they produce a statistical normal model, but you cannot predict any one ball, or you cannot look at any one ball and therefore determine what path it took or where it started. That's why I mentioned the die roll earlier. It's always going to be more likely that the dice were put down there intentionally with those numbers than that they were rolled. And if you come across, was it rolled once? Was it rolled 4 times? Was it rolled 36 times? Was it rolled 700 times? You don't know because you don't have enough information. Bayesian analysis and statistical evaluations require more than just some prior probability, for which maybe the prior probability for God is 0. We don't know. But we don't get to do that in Bayesian analysis. People say, oh, no, you can't say 0. You have to just go really, 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 really low. But when we're talking about what's actually happened in reality, that's fundamentally different. It's nice that I did videos on Mary color theory and candidate explanations and poker odds, but in the rebuttal already, Matthew's kind of misrepresented some things. I presented no evidence against God existence. That's not required. If you have an unfalsifiable God, you are essentially shifting the burden of proof to suggest that I need to present evidence against God. I didn't say that hard data and empirical evidence were what was required to believe in God. I said they were preferable. I even gave an example of I love you to show that there are things where there might not be, and you could still be warranted in believing those things. Simpler is a better explanation, is not Occam's razor, and it's not even true. And simpler is a good way to confuse people, because is a unicorn that can create a God or create a universe simpler than a God that can create a universe and do everything? Yes, that's a more simple explanation, and it's consistent with the existence of a universe. Assuming a limited God, well, I'll just skip that one. If Matthew said that it was a perfect God, must be the case because it's good to create life. Says who? Why on earth would anybody have reason to think that it's good to create life? It's, I would agree that arbitrary limits are problematic, but it's not arbitrary limits when we're talking about statistical facts in the universe. An all-knowing being knows every fact. Cool. But since we don't have access to every fact, we would have no way to fact check it, is the problem, whether you're talking all-knowing or not. So an all-knowing and nearly all-knowing being are indistinguishable to those of us who don't have a way to do it or to evaluate it. Dark matter was a label that was put on a mystery that we then refined and further defined. It was not proposed as in its entirety and then discovered that it was true through investigation. There couldn't be evidence for an all-powerful God, but that's not my problem. Numbers are abstractions. They're not real. And I haven't evidently given a reason for God to be hidden, but nobody's given a reason for God to not be hidden, or that creating people is good, or that anything about this is good. It's just, wow, this seems really unlikely if there's no God, so there must be.
And that's time. All right, so we are going to move on to the open discussion portion. I do want to say, I don't know, Matt, what your thoughts are on this. If maybe we can, if theists in the audience are in chat and you're a little apprehensive maybe about sending a super chat to Matt and you want to tag me at Ardenhart to consider your question, because right now most of our questions are for Matthew, and I feel like that's a little bit unfair. So if there's some theists in the chat who want to send some questions, tag me and I will give you a free pass.
Sounds good.
All right, so this section is going to be 30 minutes. Let me get that clock all set up. And oops. Sorry about this.
No.
Yep. No, go ahead.
All right. So, Matt, suppose that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out made by God with love in every human language. And suppose that we had sort of definitive scientific proof that this was not the byproduct of a limited simulator. Like, the only two possibilities were that this was a byproduct purely of chance, or that it was the byproduct of an all-powerful God. Would you say that that was evidence that there was a God?
I have no idea. In that particular hypothetical scenario, which, by the way, is not remotely what we have, I think it could be completely understandable why people would reasonably conclude that that was a message from a God. I don't understand the in every possible language. I mean, it seems like...
Sorry, I said in every human language.
Okay, I don't know how it's possible to say. So individually, there's like a billion statements there covering every language and dialect, and they all say created with love from God.
Yeah,
Then at a
you can
minimum,
imagine it's in really small writing.
sure, at a minimum, that would make it seem that it's rational to conclude that there is a being capable of doing that, and that may be sufficiently close to godlike for us to not care whether it's the omnimax God or not. But in any case, it would be really, really incredible evidence that it's more likely that there's a being capable of doing that. Whether or not it's a God is a separate thing.
Okay, and so the reason you would say that it's reasonable to conclude there's a being that can do that is because the odds of that happening by chance are super low, and the odds of it happening if there was a being who wanted to create it are super high, right? That's sort of the broad picture.
We can't calculate. Okay, so, but it seems, given the information we have, that it is less likely for that to happen by chance than by intent. However, we only have one occurrence. And so I don't know how we determined what the odds are for any of this with one occurrence.
Okay, so follow up. And how's that scenario different from fine tuning? Like, in the case of the initial conditions being that way, you'd say, look, it's so unlikely it would be that way by chance. That because even though there's no reason to expect that a God would definitely do it that way, you think maybe there's a reason a God would do it that way, and it's so unlikely to happen by chance that a designer doing it is the best explanation. So why is that different from fine tuning, where the odds of it happening by chance are on the order of 1 in Google?
Yeah. So the reason that a message written in every human language is less likely. Let me phrase your question correctly. You're saying, why is that more acceptable than the fine tuning that you see to conclude a God?
Yep.
Because human languages are our inventions and are the result of our progress. And so to have them written in human language from the beginning of time is a completely different category of things than having life evolve to fit the physical properties of the universe in which it inhabits. You could change some of the constants, you could change things and have a different universe crop up where a different set of life forms would be considering how the universe was created for them. The difference between your fine-tuning and this hypothetical message is that your fine-tuning is predicated on the notion that we are the goal rather than what we are, which is what can evolve in the system.
So, Matt, what are some of the examples of fine-tuning that are cited by theists that if the constants were to be changed, do you think you could get a different kind of life? Like, for example, do you think that about the cosmological constant? Do you think that about the Higgs mass?
I have no idea. I'm not even convinced that those things could. I'm sorry. What?
Well, sorry. So what you just said was that, look, if you change the constants, you could get life arising under different conditions, and then there's different kinds of life. Yeah, and then you said there's different kinds of life. Then they would be wondering to themselves, "Oh, it's so surprising we got them." So I'm asking, which constants do you think you could change where you'd get different kinds of life? Do you think that about the cosmological constant? Do you think that about the Higgs mass? Which one is this true of?
I don't know that it's true of any of them. I was presenting a hypothetical that if in some other universe with different content, in a different universe with those constants being changed some, it may be the case that something else exists and evolves and thinks that they are the special creation. I have no idea what they could change or what kind of life. It's not my field at all. It's not.
Yeah. So
okay.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry to cut you off. There were points when I thought you were done, but I think there's a slight delay, so I think that might be right. Yeah, so I don't think that's plausible, actually, for the specific instances of fine-tuning. So take the cosmological constant, for example, which governs how rapidly the universe expands. If the cosmological constant were a little bit weaker, then much less than 1 millisecond after the Big Bang, everything would have collapsed in on itself. If it were a little bit stronger, everything would have flown apart much less than 1 millisecond after the Big Bang started. And the only values of the cosmological constant that give rise to complex structures that don't result in everything imploding or in everything flying apart are values of the cosmological constant that fall in a portion of the possible range that's about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of the values you could take on. So my question for you is this, Matt, do you think that if everything flew apart after less than a millisecond, that you could get a stable form of life?
I have no idea. That's not relevant and not my area of expertise. And the way that you're framing this is very problematic because I've already acknowledged that I'm not convinced those constants could have been any other way. But even, let's imagine that there's a multiversal universe generator and it keeps popping out universes. Even if all the constants lead to disaster immediately and no life other than the one we're in, that does not tell you that it was created intentionally. You are literally still, even if it was accidental, living in the only universe that could produce you.
Yeah. So I'll address the multiverse thing in a second. So you're giving a few different replies to fine-tuning. So the first one you gave was you suggested that life could have arisen under different conditions. I think that's clearly not true for the reason I just described.
That's not what I was saying about this reality. I'm not saying that about this reality at all. You're talking about if the constants had been different. And I specifically said that I don't know that the constants could be different, but in a hypothetical.
So your second reply was you say, you don't know that the constants could be different. Okay, so in the made by God case, imagine a person said the following. They said, look, it's not at all surprising that the constants spell out made by God in every human language. I'm not even convinced that they could spell out anything else. Would you say that that's a convincing reply in a world like that?
No.
So how's that different from the constants being finely tuned?
Because all of the language elements that would only occur and exist billions of years after the formation existed at the formation. That is fundamentally different. It's not like the constants of the universe dictated Spanish necessarily, but even if hard determinism were true and the constants of the universe specifically led to Spanish is not evidence that it could have been any other, or the absence of Spanish wouldn't be evidence that it occurred any other way.
Right. So you're saying that it's very improbable that the things that would be the initial conditions would happen to correspond to any written human language. And I would say, yeah, but I also think it's really improbable that the cosmological constant, out of all of the values that one could imagine it taking on, would take on a value that happens to be one of the minuscule portions of possible cosmological constant values that give rise to the formation of complex structures. Now,
Except that is the only way any of us have this conversation.
Okay, well, so that's a different reply. So now you're raising the kind of anthropic bias reply. Okay, so I'll address that, but I just flag, that's a different reply from saying that the constants couldn't have been different. So I think the problem with the constants couldn't have been different reply is that if we bought that reply, we would also buy that reply in the scenario where the initial conditions spelled out made by God, because you could similarly say, look, that's not improbable because they can't be anything else.
No, because the constants must exist before there can be the language that results from it in the long term, even in a hard deterministic universe. You've created a fictional scenario that is used as an intuition pump to deceive people into accepting something that is unwarranted. And so please show me in the constants how it is written with love from God in every language. And until then, you have invented a fictional science fiction scenario in order to say, if this happened, we'd have good reason to believe in God. And even in that scenario, I was correct in pointing out that if that happened, we would have good reason to conclude that something intentionally did that. Because at the beginning of the universe, Spanish, Latin, French, English, none of that exists. And so that is specifically predicting something that cannot exist at 5 minutes after the universe existed.
Right. But so both the constants and the initial conditions of the universe existed at the start of the universe. In both cases, there's a value that you could imagine them taking on, where it's very unlikely that they would take them on. Now, but let me address what you said like a minute ago, where you said, look, if the constants hadn't been that way, then we wouldn't have been around to observe it. That's not relevant to whether it's evidence for whether it's evidence for the existence of God. So as an analogy, if my parents had not had me, I would not have been around to observe that fact, or I would have been non-existent. But nonetheless, the fact that my parents did have me is good evidence that my parents did not use effective contraception. Or to use a famous case from the philosopher John Wesley, imagine there are 100 men who line up and there's a firing squad, and they all point their guns at you, and they all fire them, and all of them miss, and so you get away. And later you're thinking back and you're like, that's pretty improbable. All 100 of them miss? Maybe there's a conspiracy. Maybe something improbable happened. But then you've been watching an episode of the Matt Dillahunty show, and you say, no, nothing that improbable happened. Or if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been around to observe it. So, I couldn't have been around to observe myself not surviving. that would be a bad inference. It would still be evidence for a conspiracy. Similarly, your existence can still be evidence for the fine-tuning, for the existence of God.
I love how you're referring to parents and sex and 100 shots and all this stuff, when the problem here is that we have one universe, one set of circumstances, and that's all we can explore. We don't know if there are others, were there others, could there be others, none of that. And so,
okay, so
in this particular, how did you determine, is it possible for this universe to exist without a God intending it to exist?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I just think that it's much less likely than it existing with a God who intends it to exist.
Sure. Is it possible for me to roll double sixes?
Yes.
Is it also much less likely that if I rolled double sixes and you came along and looked at them, is it still much less likely that I rolled them than that I intentionally put them that way?
So you also have to look at the prior probability, which is how likely it is.
I'm sorry. We don't have any prior probability, and that's not an answer to my question. If you come across and see that there are a double six dice on the table, is it still more likely, you not knowing what happened, that this is the result of someone intentionally setting them to double sixes than it is that they rolled them fairly?
Yeah, I actually don't know which one's more likely, but the difference between this and the God case is that I agree that the fact that they're both set to 1, that would be evidence that someone set it that way, rather than just rolling it by chance. But probably people are more likely to roll dice than to set them in a particular way, so you also have to look at the priors. That's why in my opening statement, I analyzed the prior probability of God's existence. Okay, so the
problem here is that you've completely ignored and reframed the question. The answer is that the likelihood of those sixes being rolled or not does not change based on the information you have in any given time.
Yeah, so that isn't right. You observing 2 6s, that's evidence that they were set to get 2 6s. It might not be sufficient evidence, but it is evidence because it's more likely on the assumption that they were both set to be 6s than on the assumption that they were not.
This is just not. You are inverting things. The fact that X is more likely on Y doesn't mean that the existence of X makes Y more likely.
It literally does. If you Google definition of
conditional
probability,
not. It does not in any way. So if you're sitting here and so first of all, you know what the odds of rolling double sixes is. It's 1 in 36. And you know that because we know a great deal about dice and we know how to calculate the odds. And we know that on a single roll, I could roll double sixes. And when those hit the table, anybody walking by who didn't see me roll them would still have to acknowledge that it was more likely that this was intentionally set there than that it was rolled fairly. And so when you ask that person the question, hey, which of these is more likely? It's more likely on God. It's more likely on someone setting it. Which one actually happened is the question we're actually asking. If you say, Matt, is it more likely for a universe like this to exist if there's a magical being that can intentionally make a universe like this? My answer is yes, absolutely. Now, what is the right answer for why this instance occurred? You cannot go from statistical analysis and then say, here's an instance, what was the cause? It doesn't matter whether it's more likely under God or not. That doesn't in any way demonstrate that that was the cause, which is evidenced in part by the fact that we're calculating the odds for dice rolls. We don't include God in the calculations.
So I think you should. So first of all, regarding your claim about conditional probability, that's a straightforwardly false mathematical claim. If A is likelier given B than given not B, then B is likelier given A than not A. Okay. Second of all, and you can ask ChatGPT about this. Second of all,
I don't need to ask ChatGPT because ChatGPT is a predictive language model and not an an AI, and not capable of it. ChatGPT gets stuff wrong all the time, and it is absolutely embarrassing. Rather than to suggest that you could address it, to tell me to go talk to ChatGPT, I'd rather go talk to a fake girlfriend.
We could go through the derivation of it or something, but anyways.
I don't need to go through the derivation. I need you to demonstrate that merely because it's a universe like this is more probable on a God that wants to create this universe, that is in fact the correct answer for this universe. The problem with this is that you cannot look at any specific occurrence and say, oh, it is more probable. You can say it's more probably the result of this, but you can't say this is more probable based on this observation.
So, Matt, what I said in my opening statement was that if you want to look at whether a conclusion is reasonable to believe, what you have to do is not merely look at its explanation of the data, but you also have to look at the prior probability, right? So if you get one lucky hand in poker, it's true that the theory that you're cheating explains why you would get that. It's some evidence for that hypothesis, but it's not ultimately reasonable to believe because it's not enough evidence to overcome the low prior. That's why in my opening statement, I gave several different lines of evidence, and I argued that they have significant weight, both individually and cumulatively. Sorry, I do have one question. Can you tell me anything that would be evidence for God's existence on your view?
No.
Okay, nothing would be evidence for God?
No, that's not what I said. And also, you misrepresented this. No, would you let me finish? Because you misrepresented me already in your rebuttal, and now you're trying to misrepresent me again when I answered your question. So you said that I said that hard data and empirical evidence were required to believe in God. I didn't say that, nor is that my position. You just asked me if I could give you an example of what would count as evidence, and I said no, and you tried to reframe that as if I was saying there is nothing that would be evidence. The fact that I can't give you an example of what would qualify is not me saying there is nothing that would qualify. My answer to this, which I've given for 20 years probably, is that I don't know what it would take to convince me that a God exists. And this is why I started with something from Arthur C. Clarke, because I don't know how to tell the difference between a sufficiently advanced technology and magic. But if there's a God, God absolutely knows what would change my mind and should be capable of doing it. And the fact that this hasn't happened means that either that God doesn't exist or that this God doesn't want me to know it exists yet. But in no point does me saying no to can you provide an example of what evidence would convince you of God, in no way is that equivalent to me saying there is no evidence that would convince me of God. That is just utterly dishonest.
Yeah, so you say that you think there likely is some evidence that you could convince you of the existence of God. If there is a God,
I didn't say that
God
either.
would know what it is.
I didn't say that either. It's like you're not listening to a word I say. I said that I can't give you an example. I didn't say there wasn't any example, and I didn't say whether it was likely there would or could be an example. You are rephrasing everything I've said in a way that is absolutely dishonest in what I actually said. So try again.
You said that if there was a God, then that God would know what it was that could convince you that he exists. Okay, so it sounds like there is something.
If there is a God, by your definition of God, that God knows facts, knows all facts, and therefore that God knows what facts would convince me and knows the facts about what should convince me. That's it.
Okay, so how do you know there are any facts that convince you?
I don't know that there are any facts. I don't know that there's any God. Do you understand hypotheticals? Where if God, okay, cool. If God and God knows, and if there is something that would convince me that God knows it, I have no idea whether either of those are true. You're the one claiming that one of them is true. That's it.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I don't know if there are any facts that would convince you. I think there are facts that make it reasonable to believe. I don't know what would convince you.
I don't either.
So one question. In my opening statement, I described a view called the self-indication assumption, which is the view according to which your existence is more probable given a theory on which there are more people that presently exist.
Yep.
Do you accept the self-indication assumption? And if not, what do you make of the argument I gave for the self-indication assumption?
I think it's the exact same thing phrased a different way, which is it more likely? Is my existence more consistent with a God that created a universe that wanted to result in me? Yes. But my existence is not confirmation that that is what actually happened.
Okay, so, and I've given my reply to that, which is I think that your existence is likelier if there's a God that wants to create you than if there's not. But it's not.
This is irrelevant. If I get it, no.
It's not
okay. This isn't just. This is 20 back and forth. That is not all just you asking me questions. I have questions to ask you as well. But go ahead.
I mean, I was finished. I finished before you said your thing. Sorry. Go ahead. Ask a question if you'd like.
Why is it good to create life?
Well, I think the reason to create life, the reason why that's good, is that it's good when people exist, when they have happiness over the course of their life. One of the most widely agreed upon views among philosophers about what things are good is that, happiness is a good thing. And so if there's a being who can bring about very large amounts of happiness, and they have no constraints on how much of it they can do, and they're morally perfect, then it's likely that they would bring it about, or at least not very unlikely. And I think anyone who's not an antinatalist should accept this. They should accept it's good to create people.
The problem is that you're just brushing off antinatalism and then scooping everything in with antinatalism. So if God doesn't, in your model, does God just create happiness?
God creates people who he gives good lives to, and I think these lives are particularly good when you take into account.
What about the people who don't have good lives? What about the people who don't have good lives?
There are any people who will ultimately not have good lives, because I think God will ensure an infinitely good afterlife for everyone. I think that's what would be required.
So your solution to the problem with reality is to posit an extended reality for which you don't have evidence, and that's where the good comes.
No, I don't not have evidence for it. We have evidence in the form of evidence for the existence of God, and if there's a perfect God, and it's good to give people an infinitely good reality, well, then God would be expected to do that. Sorry, do you agree that if there were a perfect God, it would be likely to give people an infinitely good total existence? Because that's a good thing to do.
First of all, you're just asserting that it's good. You're not demonstrating it's good. And second of all, you're basically saying you know what a perfect being would do. I don't. How do you know that a perfect being wouldn't conclude that humans, that imperfect beings, that creating imperfect beings is ultimately a mistake? Because a perfect being has nothing to learn from us, has nothing to benefit from us, is not missing anything. Otherwise, they would be imperfect. So why would a perfect being create anything?
So the reason a perfect being would create anything is that, as I was saying before, it's good for a person to exist and to live a happy life. And it's good to do that even if you don't learn things from the people that you create.
Good for who?
I think we have a difference in how... I think we have a difference in how we go about doing moral epistemology. So my view is...
I'm not doing moral epistemology. I'm not even evaluating this on moral. You say it's good for people to exist. It may be good for some people to exist. But is it good for God for people to exist?
Well, if God is morally perfect, then it's not a question of whether it's good for God. It's a question of whether it's good, full stop, for people to exist.
No. There's no such thing as good, full stop. It's good for some.
Why do you think that? Why do you think there are no such thing as good, full stop? Like, for example, I think the Holocaust was bad, okay? It was bad, full stop, It wasn't just bad for the people it affected. It was bad. The world is a worse place as a result of it happening.
So we should probably stop using language like full stop, because we're talking about two completely different things there. When you say it is good for people to exist, is it good for insects that people exist?
Well, that's a funny example to bring up. I've written a lot about human impact on insects, but I actually think yes, but I grant there are certain creatures for which our existence is not good, like factory farm animals.
I wasn't making any conclusion, because I can see a case where our existence is good for insects and some insects, and our existence is bad for others, especially as we use pesticides to kill some of them off and mess with the ecosystem, and ultimately we may be wiping ourselves out in that case. But your basic claim here is that a perfect being would create people because it's good for people to exist, but it's not good for that being to exist. So what's the motivation for a perfect God to create imperfect beings? It doesn't benefit God.
Right. So the motivation is, as I described, I think some things are just good, full stop. I think if there was just like huge amounts of torture on Mars, where just like everyone on Mars was suffering, there were large numbers of people suffering on Mars, I wouldn't just say that's bad for the creatures on Mars. I'd say that that's bad, full stop. But I don't think we need to get into the weeds about exactly the probabilities here, because it doesn't matter the exact probabilities. The point is the probabilities are astronomically higher than the probabilities given.
I wasn't even talking about probabilities. I asked you, how did you determine that it's good to create people? I didn't ask anything about probability.
What I was saying is you don't have to think from the outset that it's good to create people. The point is, if you think the fact that people exist against all the odds, despite the fact that this requires a coincidence on the order of a probability of 1 part in 10 to the 120th, the fact that this happens, that people exist, is evidence for there being a being who wants to create them. all you have to think is that the odds that a good God would want to create are higher than the roughly, 1 in Google odds of there being people who exist given atheism or given a single universe now.
So we've already established that you think it's possible for this universe to exist without a God, and you think the evidence points to a perfect God. Is it possible for this universe to exist with an ambivalent or malevolent God?
Yeah, but I don't think possibility is what we should care about. So if I get 10 royal flushes in a row, it's possible for me to get 10 royal flushes in a row without me cheating. But nonetheless, you have very good evidence that I'm cheating because it's so much likelier if I am cheating that I would get that than if I'm not.
Yes.
It's also possible that you would just by chance get the initial conditions spelling out made by God, but it would still be reasonable to believe in a creator in that case because it's so much more likely that you would have that if there was a creator.
Yeah, it's wild that you keep going to fantastical situations of let's get 100 full straight flushes, or let's have it written in every language in there, and trying to derive an analogy between, oh, God wrote I love you and created you in every language, and make that analogous to the constants of the universe. And then I agree with you about the poker thing, that at some point we can say that it is so statistically unlikely that even if we're wrong, we are better acting as if there was cheating going on. It is, and we may even be able to convict someone that, yes, you were likely to be cheating, but we could still be wrong. The problem with that when it comes to the universe, is we have one. We have nothing to compare it to. We have zero gods. We have zero demonstration that a God is possible, that your omnimax God is possible. And even under your model, it is not even necessarily clearly preferable. Because what if there's an ambivalent being that actually creates all this and loves to cause chaos, and so gives us a model under which we seemingly can use reason to evaluate things and allows us to fight and argue over the different conclusions we come to rather than settling it?
Yeah, so you say, look, we have no evidence that this being is possible. So you're right, I'm using lots of analogies, but analogies can show what's wrong with a bad argument, in that if you can raise a bar for evidence that's too high so that it would disbar lots of valid instances of inference. So in a case where we discovered that the initial conditions spelled out made by God with love in every human language, we would not have first demonstrated that a creator was possible. Instead, what would have happened was that we would have gotten evidence for a creator.
I did not say that you had to start with that. I'm saying that it hasn't happened. And
there are lots of things you've noted, you've sort of triumphantly held up as if they mean that the position is unreasonable. So you say, well, you could have the facts of the world, you could have our universe without a God, and that I haven't demonstrated that it's possible. So for the reasons I described, those things are totally irrelevant. You don't need to demonstrate it's possible beforehand. All you need to do is get evidence for it.
No. This is where your analogy to dark matter. This is why your analogy to dark matter fails. Dark matter wasn't posited as it exists now. You are filling a gap in our knowledge by positing that something is likely and then showing that the magic being that is capable of producing this exact universe means that this universe is more likely on that magic being. The existence of X is always going to be more likely on the proposition that there's something intending X than that it happened by natural order. If you have no way to tell the difference between things that occur naturally and things that occur by design, you don't get to assert design. When I come across a bunch of sticks in a river, I don't know immediately whether it's a designed beaver dam or if it's the result of a river wash. And I would need to investigate and get more data. But in this case, we have exactly one universe.
Yeah. So we also have exactly one universe in the made by God case. We also have exactly one universe in the dark matter case. Now, regarding the point you made about how, so you're right that it isn't enough to just point to improbable things and say that there must be a creator who did it. What it has to be is it has to be likelier on the mere assumption that there's a creator than on the assumption of chance. Given that on the assumption of chance, if it's not, then it's no evidence for a creator. It might be evidence for a very specific kind of creator who would do that, but that very specific kind of creator, like the kind of creator who would build something highly specific, has a much lower prior, and so it's not overall reasonable to believe.
And that is time on the open discussion. So we are going to re-up that clock for 30 minutes, and then we are going to be taking some questions from the audience. Reminder, I was giving Theus a free pass. If you tag me, I will try to put your question through, although we are also at a point now where I'm going to have to be managing I won't be able to take any new questions is basically what I'm saying. So you had your chance, not taking any more freebies.
Yeah, well, we got a time limit.
Yep. And so we're going to get started on that clock now. And I did try to source like a balance in questions and tried to pick from the best. There was a few that were just, I think, just comments, not really questions. So first question for Matthew comes from J Mike. He was asking, it seems plausible there are some people A and B where A exists if and only if B doesn't exist. Wouldn't this undercut God creating all possible people?
So 2 things. First of all, the argument doesn't require that God creates all possible people. It requires that God creates a number of people that's equal in size to the number of possible people. That may sound like the same thing, but it's really not. So the way you determine the size of infinities is with cardinalities, which is a measure of whether you can put them into one correspondence. By this standard, the size of the natural numbers is equal to the size of the number of prime numbers because you can pair them 1-to-1. So that's not a problem, first of all. And then second of all, I have a view, and we haven't gotten into this, I have reasons for this, but I think people are essentially souls. If what people are essentially is souls, then God could instantiate all of the souls without needing for, one of the souls, like without any of the souls that exist, only being able to be instantiated if a second one is not.
Okay, thank you. And then this one is for Matt. There are circumstances where self-sacrifice has to occur for the best moral outcome. How can you get there through an atheist worldview? Not particularly related to the topic, I guess, but it was directed towards you.
So maybe you can't, but maybe you can. I don't know how this question is relevant to anything, but whether or not an atheist worldview is consistent with anything good or beneficial or pleasurable or whatever is irrelevant to whether or not there is a God and whether or not it's right. The notion that the universe is an uncaring, indifferent place to our existence seems relatively accurate, and we don't have good reason to think that there is a God tinkering or doing anything, which is why instead of presenting evidence for any of this, we keep going back to possibilities and hypothetical. Oh, there's an afterlife that'll solve this problem. There's a soul that solves this problem, none of which is evident. And so that an atheist worldview, a world without a God, may not make people happy or provide an afterlife or even keep people moral is irrelevant to whether or not that model is true. I'm not just an atheist. I'm a skeptic and a secular humanist. And my humanism informs my moral positions, and my skepticism informs my rational positions, and both of them together, well, skepticism leads to atheism when evaluating the God claims, but the humanism is what leads to the moral thing. So it's consistent with an atheist worldview, which is that subjectively we are going to prioritize ourselves and our well-being. And then once we have that established as a goal, we can then evaluate the consequences of our actions to see if it furthers that goal or not.
All right. Thank you very much. So this one is another one for Matthew. If the universe has always just existed, getting in the way. If the universe has always just existed, what need is there for a God to create it?
Even if you think the universe is eternal, it can be surprising, even given an eternal universe, that there would be fine-tuning. Like, even if the universe were to be eternal, it would be surprising that the universe would ever be able to produce any complex structures, that it would have consciousness, or that it would have you out of the, uncountably infinite possible people. Lots of theists seem to think that the case for their position hinges a lot on the age of the universe. These people buy the Kalam argument. I'm not very moved by the Kalam argument. And so I don't think it would affect my position very much, whether the universe is finite or infinitely old.
Okay. A question for Matt. Let's see. If X is expected on Y and we have X, that does not raise the probability of Y, what does? What account of probability do you use if not Bayes?
So if X is expected on Y, the existence of X does not change what that expectation is. if there's, if it's a one-to-one thing, the presence of X can be said to be consistent with Y, expected in Y, more probable if Y, but it is not sufficient to conclude therefore Y, because there are other potential explanations as well. Now, the example that Matthew gave earlier is that his parents had sex and evidently did not make use of effective contraception. And I would say that that's a reasonable conclusion. Maybe they didn't use any. Maybe they used some that broke. Maybe they used some that wasn't effective. Doesn't matter. All of that's consistent with it. And so all that is saying, if my existence is more consistent with parents that don't use contraceptives that are effective than it is with parents that use contraceptives that are effective. Cool. But your existence is not itself confirmation of that. The only reason we see it that way is because we have a great number of instances of people and contraception and failed contraception. And yet you also have miraculous births, supposedly. I mean, did God fail to use effective contraception when he impregnated Mary? I don't know. But you have, if you step outside the realm of humans, I raise reptiles. And there are a number of reptiles that reproduce parthenogenically. And so in that case, we have more information. If you didn't know that parthenogenics was possible and you came across a reptile giving birth, you would assume that that reptile had sex and didn't use effective contraception, because that's the assumption we make given the information we have. All of this is tied to the massive amount of information, which is why when we evaluate things, we don't just say, oh, you said you had a pet dog. You said you had an invisible pet dragon. The invisible pet dragon is more extraordinary and therefore requires more evidence. No, what we say is, I already have a truckload of evidence that dogs are real, that people keep dogs as pets. I have no evidence to support that invisible dragons are real or that they're kept as pets. So the additional evidence you have to provide beyond your word, beyond your say-so of I have a pet dog for I have an invisible pet dragon, that is the thing. It's not that the claim itself requires more data. It's that the pet dog already exists with a truckload, a mountain of data behind it. And we ignore that because we don't sit here and analyze things in detail. We don't sit here and draw syllogisms and do math. We train our gut to infer and assume and predict things. And so it's intuitive to say, oh, I wouldn't be here if my parents had used effective contraception. Okay, explain Jesus. But you don't get to say that we have this wealth of data, therefore we can reach this conclusion about what the probability is, and then narrow it down to one universe and make proclamations about the cause.
Okay. So I'm going to pitch this question, and then I'm going to step away for just a second because I just heard a loud thud downstairs, and I want to make sure our cat did not break something. So, question is for you, Matthew. Yeah. Why is creating life assumed to be good? Can't life be created to create suffering? Further, how does this argument circumvent the Euthyphro dilemma?
So the Euthyphro dilemma is not a problem because I'm not claiming that morality comes from God, and it's only a problem if you think that, which I don't. Regarding why it's good to create, so remember, for the argument to work, you don't have to think at the outset that it's very likely that it's good to create. All you need to think is that it's not totally ridiculous that it's good to create, because the odds, even if you think the odds starting out are 1% or something, it's still way higher than the astronomically low odds on atheism. Now that said, okay, why is it good to create? Well, it's good to create because it's good to exist, to live a happy life. Just like it's bad to exist if your life is just full of misery, it's good to exist if you live a good life. And I think for this reason, we should expect God to guarantee everyone to have an infinitely good afterlife. Once you think that's the situation for everyone who comes to exist, which I think is very likely conditional on theism, then it looks like it's very likely that God would guarantee to create. Regarding antinatalism, there are lots of antinatalist arguments. I can't go into them in any detail. If you want to see more, I have a philosophy paper called The Sequence Argument Against Procreation Asymmetry, where I argue that it's good to create in more detail. So you can check that out if you want to hear more of my answer to this.
Okay. Let's see. So a few of these questions for Matt are okay, here we go. This one's decent. So for Matt, Universe's constants tuned to 1 in 10 to the 60th odds. Why favor chance / multiverse instead of design? What improbability level would convince you?
There is no improbability level that could convince me on its own. As long as there remains a possibility, see, one of the things is that the fact that X is more likely on Y doesn't tell you how likely Y is, or if Y is even possible, empirically possible or probable. And so I'm not saying that that's not a factor in determining. I'm saying that's not the only factor. So when I look at a royal flush, if you walked up and sat down at your very first poker table and the first hand you got was a royal flush, you might be sitting there going, this is wild. How on earth have I gotten such an unlikely outcome the first time? Am I being punked? Am I on TV? Am I right? You're already going through a list of all the candidate explanations, and one of them is, I got lucky. If you never played another hand of poker, you would have no way to assess that information. And this is why I keep pointing out that you can't go to multiversal, we only have the one. You played one poker hand. You know what the odds are of getting a royal flush, but you don't know what the odds are of cheating. You don't know how likely it is, how difficult it is, how prevalent it is. You don't have any other examples to compare it to. And at this point, you don't even know if cheating was possible. All you know is you sat down and played a hand and you got a royal flush. The single instance of that cannot possibly be sufficient to conclude that therefore there was cheating. What you can say is it's more likely if there was cheating, and that's true. Every time I get a royal flush, it's more likely that somebody was cheating than not. And by the way, every time I get the worst hand possible, when I get, 7-2 offsuit, that's also more likely on cheating. Each individual occurrence, every possible shuffle of this deck of cards is in and of itself more probable on someone intentionally arranging it that way than it is on someone on just random. However, what we're doing is we're looking at one particular shuffle of this deck and saying this one's special, therefore it's more likely someone cheated. We don't think when you get a crappy hand, someone cheated. You might, and you should, because they absolutely will cheat to give you the worst hands. But we get more suspicious when it's meaningful. If I deal out 4 hands and you end up with all 13 spades, you have the perfect bridge hand. That is incredibly unlikely, and yet it has happened multiple times because there's 13 factorial different combinations of that as well. But it's incredibly unlikely, and it just looks significant. They're all the same color. We've got one of each number, just like when you get 4 kings or whatever. All of those seem significant because they're significant to us. And we seem to be the significant focal point of the universe because we're significant to us. And so this is all about, a perfect God would make people because it's good to make people. Well, I'm not convinced it's good to make people for anybody other than the people and other than some people. How do we know that there's not a God who is intentionally making some people more miserable than others, who is allowing us to fight instead of solving stuff, how do we tell the difference between a universe that is created by a God with the intent of producing us versus a universe created by a God with the intent of producing black holes, and we just happen to be a side effect, versus a universe that was not intended by any God, but as the product of natural processes, and that we are the result. If you don't have a way to distinguish between those, it's meaningless to say this universe is more likely if we are the intended product of a God. You're correct. And then the response should be, so what? Until you demonstrate why it's the right answer, I should not accept it.
Okay. Now we've got a question from I Am the Cheese to Matthew. What would be a sufficient test to falsify the fine-tuning claim in this current cosmological reality we live in?
So I think there could be a few ways it could be falsified. The most straightforward one is if we discovered that if we had wildly different constants, then you could still get life. So if we would discover that, for instance, that really the cosmological constant doesn't have to fall in this narrow range, that you could get life even if it was much bigger or much smaller, then yeah, that would straightforwardly falsify the argument. It's based on scientific facts about the world that have been uncovered by physicists since the 1980s, where the case for fine-tuning has only grown. Also, I think if you got evidence, for sufficiently strong evidence for like a multiverse, and a very simple multiverse where it doesn't, like if there was a sort of viable multiverse model that was very simple and that could sort of nicely solve fine-tuning, then I think that could also be evidence. I mean, sorry, that would also at least take some of the force out of fine-tuning. I think it would still have some force because you'd need to fine-tune that multiverse, but that would certainly sort of eliminate some of the force.
Okay. Oh my God. So a mathematician has sent a little thing here that I can't read. I'm going to send it to you in chat, Matt, and you can read that next time. I'm going to read you a different one that I can actually read this time, and then you can answer the other one next time.
Okay.
Whose side is the mathematician on?
It's a question for Matt about Bayes' theorem. So this question, though, is if 2 dice on a table having 6s up isn't evidence that someone set them, what if there were 3 dice on the table, or 4 or 5 or 100?
Yeah, so this is another thing where
that's for Matt. Oh, wrong way. That Matt. Yeah.
This is yeah. I don't know where I would draw the line, or where, and I'm not good enough at statistics to know where the statistical probability is that this would draw the line. But I think that there would be a line there where we go, this is so clearly pointed to this particular candidate explanation that we're going to go with it because it's the one that's most probable. The issue with looking at a God creating a universe is that I don't know why that gets to be a candidate explanation in the first place. When we talk about dice and die rolling and cheating, everything that gets listed as candidate explanations are things that we know and can investigate and know to exist. When we start talking about dice, how many dice do you have to put on the table before we've debunked dark matter? I mean, so the two things don't necessarily even go together at all. And so like when Matthew was saying a minute ago that he thinks this could be falsified if we could show that a different set of constants would produce life. But if a different set of constants could produce some different life, then that life would be making the same argument we do. And even if no other constants could produce life, we'd still be here thinking the same thing. And so to say it's falsifiable if there was some other constant that would produce this is like saying I would stop accusing you of cheating if you could show me that there was another deck order that would produce that royal flush. And that is what we're actually talking about. That if there was another deck order that would produce a royal flush, that wouldn't tell you whether or not they cheated. It would just say there's a different deck order. And so in the analogy where God is defining the constants in order to produce this, that is the dealer creating the deck order in order to produce this. You don't say, I'm going to falsify the accusation that you're cheating if you can show me that a different deck order could produce a royal flush, because we already know that that can happen. We don't necessarily know that for the universe, but even in the scenario where we know there are multiple scenarios multiple deck shuffles that could produce that, that is irrelevant to whether or not any specific instance was in fact cheating.
Okay. This one's for Matthew. Has anyone established these universal constants can have any other value? Without that, why are we talking about them being tuned?
Yeah, so it's exactly the same as the case for the initial conditions spelling out made by God. You'd always say, look, maybe they're necessary. But the point is, even if you declare them necessary, it's so unlikely that that particular thing would be necessary out of all the imagined things that could be necessary. So if the constant spelled out made by God, well, you could declare it necessary. What are the odds that the necessary initial conditions would happen to necessarily be spelling out made by God? In similar fashion, if the constants are necessary, even if the constants are necessary, it's very unlikely that they'd fall in this infinitesimally narrow range. Or to give another analogy, suppose you're a determinist, okay? And suppose, a lot of poker analogies, suppose we go to Vegas, okay? And you accuse me of cheating because I get 10 royal flushes in a row. and I say, look, I'm a determinist. I think it's necessary that I get 10 royal flushes in a row. I think that would not beat the cheating allegations, because it's unlikely that I would happen to get that particular outcome out of all the outcomes that one could conceivably get, even if it's necessary. So merely just declaring something necessary doesn't get rid of the improbability when you have lots of different imaginable outcomes.
Hey, yeah, I don't know how to read the one I sent to you, Matt, but you have it.
I've got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, mathematicians asking, do I concede that if the probability of a hypothesis on certain evidence is greater than the probability of not that hypothesis on certain evidence, then E is evidence. The evidence is evidence for the hypothesis. And my answer is no, I don't concede that. I understand that. And it's because I have a particular definition of evidence for that is distinct from facts consistent with. And so, as I've already acknowledged and pointed out, yes, my existence is more probable on the proposition that a God specifically created the universe with the desire to produce me. But my existence alone does not mean that the God proposition is more probable than the other potential candidate explanations. And so that it is always more likely the case that every shuffle is the result. Well, it is more probable to receive any given shuffle on intentional manipulation. That does not mean it is more probable that any particular shuffled deck of cards is the result of cheating. The cheating thing is multiple trials. So when I talk about evidence for, it's not just a fact consistent with, and my existence is consistent with a God, and my existence is more likely if there is a God trying to make me exist. But my existence alone is not evidence for the claim that God exists and is trying to make me, because my existence is also consistent with competing candidate explanations. Whereas I don't even think God should be considered a candidate explanation. But even if it were, I can demonstrate, in some cases mathematically and discretely, the probability of certain things leading to me. I have no way of demonstrating the probability that God exists and led to me.
Okay. Let's see. For Matthew, isn't the fine-tuning argument just the prosecutor's fallacy?
No.
If you're not familiar with, I don't know what it is either. I can find you a different one.
I think the prosecutor's fallacy is like the idea is, so imagine you take, imagine you find some DNA sequence in a murder trial, and then you look through everyone in the United States, and you find the person whose DNA most closely matches with it. And then you say, it must be you because your DNA most closely matches. But you would expect someone, and plausibly someone innocent, to have their DNA most closely match. But the difference there is that in the prosecutor case, the prior probability of that particular person having done it is ridiculously low. So even though you have very strong evidence, there are lots of cases where you have a really low prior, but really strong evidence for a hypothesis. Right? So suppose there's a person who lies half the time and they tell me their phone number. I've gotten really strong evidence for that particular sequence of numbers being their phone number, but that particular sequence being their phone number has a really low prior, and so the probabilities cancel out, and I end up concluding 50% chance that it's their phone number. And so that's sort of similar to how things work with the prosecutor's fallacy. But for the reasons I described, I don't think that belief in God has a ridiculously low prior. I certainly don't think that it's anywhere near as low as the probability of these things on atheism, which is like on the order of winning the lottery many, many consecutive times, or throwing a dart and hitting a particular atom when thrown across the known universe with a cosmological constant fine-tuning, for example.
All right, we got about 6 minutes left, so let's get one question for each of you, and we'll try to keep those answers under 3 minutes. But this one just came in from Matt, and they say that you have just defined evidence such that things universally recognized as evidence don't count as evidence. Facts consistent with are obviously evidence. I figured.
I'm sorry, question, but this person, much like Matthew and a bunch of others, do not listen with the precision to assess this. I did not say evidence. I said evidence for. There's a difference between evidence and evidence for. Evidence includes facts consistent with the proposition. Evidence for that proposition are those data that point more to one particular candidate explanation than another. A dead body is evidence that someone has been murdered, and it is evidence consistent, perhaps, with the butler did it, but the body on its own is not evidence for the proposition that the butler did it. There would be other things there that might be evidence for the proposition the butler did it. The butler had the only key to the room, the butler's fingerprints were in there, the butler's bloody handprint is next to it. Those bits of evidence aren't the body, but the body is evidence to be considered with the evidence for to build a narrative case. And that's why in the video that I did about this the other day, I talked about how there are weaker evidence things that can be made stronger by the amplified evidence around it.
All right. And last question here from Matthew. I apologize to everyone who we didn't get to your question. Trying to filter out for the ones that seem the most relevant to the topic at hand. This one comes from T. Will. If the universe was fine-tuned for us, why did it take billions of years for us to show up? Why is 99.999% of the universe completely inhospitable to us? And why are large portions of the planet inhospitable to us?
So I have a longer article about this that people can read called The Argument from Scale as an Own Goal. Lots of things to say about it. So one thing is that it can be the case that you design something for some particular purpose, even if the thing for which you designed the whole system is a very small portion of it. Right? So scientists often design very elaborate experiments just to test what happens in certain microscopic bacteria. So the fact that something is just small compared to the rest of stuff doesn't tell you that it's unimportant. Now, regarding the question of why space is hostile, of why so much of the universe is hostile, I'd say the reason for that is that, insofar as you think, as I do, that God creates lots of different kinds of life, not just humans, he doesn't want them to fight, he doesn't want more advanced aliens to colonize less advanced aliens, so it kind of keeps them apart, And so that's the kind of reason why this vacuum. Regarding the kind of inhospitability of Earth, I think that will be explained for the same reason. Just whatever your explanation is for why there's so much bad stuff in the world, that will probably explain why there's hospitable stuff, for why much of the world is inhospitable. Now, that would just get to the problem of evil. I have sort of long things to say about the problem of evil, but I won't get into it. But then I think that that's more broadly wrapped up into the problem of evil. Lastly, the fact that it took a while, I don't think there's any reason to expect that God would, if he made a universe for the purpose of creating life, that he'd create them instantaneously. God, unlike a human engineer, doesn't have any time or resource constraints, so he can take as long as he wants, so long as waiting would fulfill his purposes.
Oh, you're muted, Arden.
Oh, my bad. All right. I don't really have any questions that are super pressing or that are super relevant. And I know there's 2 minutes left on the clock, but I think if you guys are ready, we can just hit our closing arguments. So you each get 5 minutes. And we'll have Matt go first, and then Matthew will get the last one. Let's move over to, and give me a second to get this clock reset. Okay, are you ready?
Go for it. Okay, so thanks to Matthew for doing this, and to Arden for producing, hosting. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and to everybody who watches this in the future. If you're the type of person interested in joining me for a debate like this in the future, feel free to contact us. We're going to be experimenting with format, time slots, and subjects. You can email sans.deity@gmail.com. We shouldn't believe things without a good reason. The resolution for this debate was we should believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being. I don't know that we heard much about justification for all-knowing, all-powerful, or morally perfect, but that's okay, because it's clear that Matthew's position is that with his understanding of all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect, this God applies, and it's consistent, at least, with the model that he's presenting. If we're going to use statistical probability, we need to make sure we're doing it correctly. It's always more likely that you were dealt a royal flush by someone who cheated than that it happened without such intervention. But that's not the case. It is always more probable to receive a royal flush on the condition that someone cheated than that they didn't. But that doesn't mean that any particular royal flush is in fact more likely to be this to the point where you can conclude, I should believe you cheated, or I should believe there is a God. That's in a scenario where we know cheating can occur, where we have a demonstration that it's possible for people to deal and cheat and stack a deck. If you found a ping pong ball sitting up at the top of a telephone pole and somebody said, oh, somebody jumped up there, you'd probably say, people can't jump that high. You'd probably make the declaration that this is not possible. And you're not saying you're concluded that it's absolutely impossible or that somebody can't fly or anything else. You're saying that there's been no demonstration that this is in fact possible. We don't get to consider it among the candidates. Doesn't mean we get to say it's false. Doesn't mean we get to exclude it from becoming a candidate. But we have no demonstration that God is possible. However, that doesn't preclude considering a God, but you have to show why it should be a candidate explanation, and then why it's a more probable candidate explanation than the natural one. And by definition, a miracle is that which is least probable. And I'm not ruling out miracles. I'm just talking about, can we conclude how or why something like that occurs, something extraordinary? What are the odds that you would be here if God exists? Depends on whether or not God wants you to exist. Depends on whether or not God agrees with Matthew that creating people is good. We don't consider that possibility when we're calculating the odds. What are the odds that anything could happen? It's the difference between magic and math. And theists are constantly trying to stick a God in magically in places where the math does not support it. I'm waiting for theists to suggest that God is a construct found in base pi because we've closed all the other doors. But cheating at cards is a known possibility, and help us calculate the odds of it happening or not. It would be absurd for you to say that dealer can stack the deck if there's no chance for that dealer to stack the deck. What if it was a computer shuffle that we can prove was random? There's no chance for cheating that you know of. We have one universe, one you, just one. No statistic, no demonstration that God is a possible candidate explanation, and yet we're being told that we should believe anyway, because we should just go with it, because if there is a God, that serves as a neat and tidy explanation for how and why we exist. It's not messy like the atheist model. It's not improbable like the atheist model. It's not even special. And yet we're being told we should believe it. What about not multiplying entities unnecessarily? If you're going to apply Occam's razor, then when you say, oh, what about this problem with your model? Well, I think there's an afterlife and that'll make up for it. Well, what about this problem with your model? Well, I think there's souls and that makes up for that. Well, what about this problem? What about this problem? Oh, God doesn't want us to fight. Then why are we fighting? Why hasn't God? If I were God and I didn't want people to fight, they wouldn't be fighting. If I were God and I wanted people to know I existed, they would know I existed. If I were God, why would I do anything? Why would I create anything? You can't just say that it's necessarily good. It's not good for God. Oh, and God can take as long as he wants. Why does he want to take any time at all? Why couldn't he? Couldn't God snap his fingers and instantly make the entire universe completely different from what it is right now and have us still sitting here carrying on a conversation, unable to know or discern the difference, and just changing everything about our language and structure so that we're now saying the same arguments in a completely different language, in a completely different environment, and with completely different facts? I see no good reason to believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect God, and no statistic is going to accomplish that.
Alrighty, let's move over to Matthew for his final word, and you are good to go, Matthew.
All right, so thanks for the debate, and if you want to find more about the arguments I've given, you can do so on my blog, Bentham's Bulldog. Now, over the course of this debate, Matt has done a lot of asking questions, but he hasn't rebutted the fine-tuning argument. He hasn't contested that the odds of getting the finely tuned constants are very low on atheism and much higher on theism. The things he's said, I think he's mostly sort of like not defended very much during the cross-examination period, nor has he discussed most of the other arguments. Now, that's fine. We didn't get to all the arguments, but I think these arguments should still be convincing. Now, he's done a lot of repeating that he's not convinced by the arguments, but the fact that an argument is not psychologically convincing to Matt isn't evidentially relevant. Nor has Matt given serious objections to Bayesian epistemology, which is the idea that you should start with the prior probability, which is how likely a theory is, before you consider the evidence, and then it goes up in probability if you observe facts that are likelier given the hypothesis than given its negation. I've given arguments for theism having a high prior probability, for it being simple, for it being parsimonious, for it being non-arbitrary. Now, he says that it's not because I posit an afterlife, but as I explained in my opening statement, the only things that deleteriously affect the simplicity of a theory are the unexplained things, the non-fundamental things. Otherwise, solipsism would be the simplest theory because it just posits your mind. But if that's right, then because an afterlife is explained by God, it doesn't detract from simplicity. Now, Matt said that that A can be likelier given B than given not B, but B would be no likelier given A than not A. This is a straightforwardly mathematically wrong claim. If you type it into GPT or your preferred AI model, it can walk you through the derivation of why it's wrong. It's like this is the sort of thing you learn in high school statistics. Now, Matt asks, why would God make life? He could make so many things that doesn't benefit him. The answer is because it's good to create life. It's good to exist and live, It's good for me that my parents created me, that I get to exist, that I get to be happy in the world. And you don't have to think that this is super likely. All you have to think is that it's more likely than the vanishingly low probability that you would get life given atheism. As an analogy, just like in the made by God case, there's no, it's not super likely that the initial conditions would spell out made by God, given that there was a designer, because it's so much likelier that it would, given that there was a designer, than given that there was not a designer. It's evidence for a designer. And so you don't have to admit. Now, Matt then says, he gives a bunch of conditions where he's trying to, he says, where he attempts to claim the evidence for God is insignificant. So he says, I haven't demonstrated that it's possible. This is irrelevant. You don't have to initially demonstrate that some claim is possible. You just have to get facts that are evidence for it in the sense of raising its probability. As I said before, scientists didn't initially demonstrate that dark matter was possible. Instead, they got evidence for it. If we saw the initial conditions spelled out made by God, we wouldn't have first demonstrated that a creator is possible. Instead, we would have gotten evidence for it. Now, his response to this was he said that belief in dark matter was tentative and changed with evidence. I don't see what that has to do with the point I was making about dark matter. The point is just you didn't have to initially demonstrate that it was possible. And he says that you could get life in a godless universe, but that's not relevant. What you need to look at is the relative probabilities of getting life in a godless universe versus in a non-godless universe. Every time you've heard Matt give a condition where he said of why he thinks the evidence from fine-tuning is insignificant, you should note that if we took that condition seriously, we would conclude that in the made by God case, there was where the initial condition spelled out made by God with love in every human language, there was no justification for thinking that there was a designer. From that case, you could also say, maybe the laws are necessary. Maybe it just happened by chance. Okay, that wouldn't be a good explanation. Matt has said maybe there are things that could change his mind, but he doesn't know what they are. I think if you have a position and you're claiming there's not evidence for it, but you have no idea what could convince you or what things would even count as evidence for it, I think that that's a kind of dogmatism. I think it's dogmatic if religious people say nothing can change their mind. I think it's dogmatic when irreligious people say nothing can change their mind. Now, Matt has made a lot of hay about the talk about decks. So in a case where a deck, where you observe some particular sequence of cards, it's true that the theory that it's rigged to get that particular sequence makes it likelier you'd get that sequence. But it doesn't overall raise the odds of rigging because there's no special reason to think it would be rigged that way. So the overall rigging hypothesis doesn't go up in plausibility. In contrast, in cases where there's a reason to think a person might rig it that way, like if we observe someone get a bunch of royal flushes, then we have reason to think that probably there is a person who rigged it to get that result. In similar fashion, if we observe the constants fall in a range where you could see a reason why an agent might create it that way, then you should think an agent, because it's so improbable if there was no agent, then that's evidence that an agent created it that way. In the dice on the table case, it's true that if the dice were set to be 6-6, that would raise the odds of seeing them be 6-6, but there's no reason to think that anyone would set them to be 6-6. The Bayesian analysis that I've given doesn't conflate evidence for and evidence consistent with, because for something to be evidence, it has to be likelier given the hypothesis.
That is your time.
That's all. Thanks so much for listening. Yeah, and thanks for the debate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew, for being here. And thank you to the audience and all the people who sent questions. Definitely leave us a like, leave us your comments and your thoughts on, if you want to see this again, thoughts on what we can do to improve the format. We'd love to hear it. And until then, we will see you guys next time. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.